Rain. Where's everybody? Oh, here we go. Now they're rolling in. How's everybody so far?
Good.
Jen right there, and Lorraine. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Hello, Sebastian. How are you?
Hi, I'm doing well. How are you?
All right. And there's Isabel. Hello.
Hello.
Christina is here. Where's Christina? It's like there.
Hi.
How you doing?
Good. Thank you. How you doing?
Hey. Arpod. Last time I got. There we go. Kendra is there. Lonnie is there. Let's see who's coming in next to Lonnie. Selma is there. Selma right here. And Ash. How you doing? Diana.
Ooh.
No. Arpod.
Yep.
Is your name Hungarian?
Yeah.
Oh, I thought that must be it. I remember one guy I knew, a consultant named Arpod. He was from Hungary as well. Don't see that name very often.
Oh.
Let's see who else. We have Galino. Ah, we got Lupido. Go. And Ariana, not yet. And Golly, not yet. Oh, Golly's here. Okay, cool. All right. I'm going to open up while we're waiting, I think, for one last person. Just let me ask if there are any questions about anything up to this point. Diana, are you at the nest still? Still? Yeah. Anybody else at the nest? Is it pretty lonely at the nest?
Right now I haven't left my room in like 2 days, so.
All right. Well, obviously you don't have a dog there, otherwise you'd be out several times. Do they let you have pets at the nest?
Yeah, you just have to qualify them as like emotional support animals. So I know they have rabbits here too, or bunnies. I don't know. I think there's a turtle.
An emotional support turtle?
Yeah.
I'd feel real emotionally supported then, I guess. All right. I'm looking for Ariana, not here yet. And anyway, give it another minute or so, and then off we go. Still open for any questions anybody might have. There, I got one more. Ariana. Ariana is here. Connecting to audio, but she is here. That's okay. Everybody's here today. What a deal. All right. Well, no questions to start. And off we go. We're going to do two things today. The first thing that we're going to do is we're going to finish up the article on Daniels. We have 3 bullets left to cover there. And then we're going to also launch into talking about world languages, not a whole lot about those, but world languages and where English fits. And then we're going to start looking at the mishmash of things that got us to English as we know it today. There have been lots of different influences. Hopefully you've read the Wikipedia article, but we're just going to kind of go back over that just to make sure that we're square on that. And one of the things I want you to do as we're going through this, particularly with the history of English, when we get there, I may remember to ask you again, but I want you to be thinking about why would I care, or why should I waste time in class talking about the history of English when we are getting ready to teach English language learners. So I want you to have that in mind as we get into that. But in the meantime, let's finish out these last few bullets on the 9 ideas about language that Daniels wrote up. And one of the things that you're going to find if you ever take any further linguistics classes, one of the things that they continue to pound on is the fact that one language is not better than another. Sometimes as English speakers, we think, oh, we've got the best language because look at all of the other people who are learning it. Well, that doesn't make English better. In fact, when I was about 19 years old, I was on my way to Korea. I was in the Army and I was on my way to Korea on the airplane, and the guy sitting next to me says, in all seriousness, anybody who doesn't speak English can't be very smart. And so unfortunately, that sometimes is what people think. Man, if you don't speak English, what good are you? Well, all the other languages are out there. We have to give them equal consideration. So the first thing to remember is one language is not better than another. Basically, the idea is that every language out there is equally capable of stating anything that the native speakers of that language want to say. Yes, they may bring in some English words to talk about technology now and then, much like we brought in Greek and Latin words to be able to do that some centuries ago. But every language, essentially, if it's a language that people speak natively, it's capable of talking about anything that the speakers need to say. The next thing to think about is there are no primitive languages. There may be languages that don't have a writing system. There may be languages that are dying because all of their native speakers are dying. And that happens literally just about every day, or every year several languages will die simply because the last native speaker has died. But there are no primitive languages. All right, there might be what we would think of as primitive cultures. I suspect you could still go down into the Amazon and find some relatively primitive cultures, not very technologically advanced. We might be able to do the same thing if we went to Africa. But even if we can really justify for ourselves that something is a primitive culture because it isn't very technologically advanced, it does not mean that their language is primitive. They can use it they use their language to get by every day. So this is a real important one to think about. And it's really important for us as English language teachers, as we begin to look at our students and realize they have a first language already. We are bringing to them a second language. But that doesn't mean that English is better. It's just probably going to be more useful in this particular environment. And as the world is going around and around, for right now, it may be more useful in being able to talk across borders. But don't think that English is the best language, because it's not. I wouldn't be at all surprised to see it be overtaken by something like Mandarin in Chinese over time, because there are just so many Mandarin native speakers, And China is gaining such stature in the world. So keep in mind that English may not be the big language for the rest of your life. It is right now, and it may stay there, but it may not. And it's not because it's better. It's probably more because it's financially effective in many cases. All right? Now, another thing to think about, and you'll see this, it happened with English in the centuries past. It happens with languages all around us all the time. But based on its place in history, a language may borrow more words than another. For instance, here's three. I've got in Malay. They speak it in Malaysia, right? And they have something called a bahasa. And Korean has a word computer. Now, does that make English better than Malay? Or does it make it better than Korean because, hey, they've essentially just co-opted our word for computer and called it computer? What do you think a bahasa is? Any guesses? Anybody ever been to Malaysia? Will have certainly, yeah, who?
Bicycle?
No, not bicycle, but that's pretty good. Good guess, not quite. Who wants to guess something else? Bahasa. Participants can now see your application.
Is it school bus?
It is exactly a school bus. You will see these big yellow school buses with a black stripe, just like you see them in the US every day. But the only difference is on the side, instead of saying school bus, it says bahasa. You can tell that they've essentially borrowed our words. If you go to Korea, for instance, and you get on the bus, the word for bus is busu. Where did that come from? I don't think we borrowed it from Korean, they borrowed it from us. But nonetheless, they have a full language that does everything that they can possibly want it to do, and where they don't have a particular word, they can borrow it. Or, in many cases, they can lend it to another language. For instance, how many of you have ever eaten kimchi? I got a Diana, I got a Gally, I got others. Maybe we don't call that red pepper pickled cabbage. What do we call it? We call it kimchi, just like the Koreans have called it for several, they'll tell you several millennia. For 5,000 years, they've called it kimchi. We didn't change it to be pickled cabbage. We still call it kimchi. We borrowed that word from them. We should recognize in the human condition, not that one language is better than another, but some languages, and particularly some dialects, will be considered the prestige language or the prestige dialect. And so that doesn't really mean that one is better than the other. It does mean, however, perhaps that one group speaking a particular language has been able to overcome another. If you go down to Southeast Asia and you look at Singapore and Malaysia, they have used a lot of English words. Most of those Malay and other languages that would have come out of Singapore did not go back to England. England was the colonizer. England brought English down to those. And so the prestige language typically in business, if you go to Singapore, where they have let's see, that shows all four, where they have 4 official languages in Singapore, they have prestige languages. One of those would be English. Another one is Mandarin. Now, if you're familiar with Chinese at all, you'll know that they have dozens of dialects. And as people came down out of China into Singapore, they brought those dialects with them. But I've spent a lot of time in Singapore back in the 80s and the 90s. And one of the things that they were very focused on was driving those non-Mandarin dialects out of the country. And you would see signs everywhere. Mandarin is Chinese. Not Teochew, not Hokkien, not all of the other ones, Cantonese that might be there, but they had a prestige language. English was generally done for business purposes, but amongst the Chinese population, they drove home the idea that Mandarin was the Chinese language of choice. It happens. It all depends on who's in charge and who has the power. And unfortunately, when we start to think about we've got a prestige language or a prestige dialect, as I mentioned, I think earlier, sometimes, unfortunately, we will find that a non-prestige value carries socioeconomic consequences. Or to say it differently, prestige dialects may be seen as more powerful and they get socioeconomic advantage. And for whatever reason, from a human perspective, they may seem that that prestige dialect, that prestige language is better, but in reality it isn't. It is just different. When we look at different dialects, we find that they have just as many grammar rules as the prestige dialect. Let's take Ave, which is African American Vernacular English, and Standard Academic English. Let's call those two out. So in a particular place like university, the Standard Academic English may be the prestige dialect. And people may look upon things like, oh, I could say she's beautiful, and it would be perfectly good in African American Vernacular English to drop the is out. And yet some people are just besides themselves when they do that. Okay? Or when people use double negatives. Well, awful lot of people, including me, use double negatives from time to time. And so in one language or one dialect, that double negative is perfectly fine. And in another, it is not. And so I've gotten a request to record this. Yeah, I can record it. So let me jump out of here for just a minute. If you really don't want to have your face on the screen, you can do that. I don't like to record usually, but what the heck? Why not?
This meeting is being recorded.
We are recording. I'm going back over to the share where we were. Continue to share, and off we go. Okay? So the idea here is one language is not better than another. Just because you speak English and more people in the world want to be able to speak English than want to be able to speak Italian, for instance, does not make it better. Okay, so hopefully that's pretty clear. Another thing to consider, and something that we will probably pay kind of a lot of attention to as we go through 301, is that writing and reading come after listening and speaking. Much of what we're going to be talking about as we go through 301 is going to be speech. How is something spoken? That's going to be important as we look at phonology particularly. It's also going to be important when we look at morphology, the second big group. A little bit less as we get into semantics. We'll see it come up, in syntax. We'll see it come up again in semantics. But the idea here is, if you think about it, reading and writing are really unnatural language uses. And that may sound strange to us because we've been reading and writing since we were 4 or 5 years old. But actually, it's a relatively new phenomenon, and it's relatively unnatural. By unnatural, I mean it's going to come later, and it's only going to come once you're instructed. That is not the same as listening and speaking. With listening and speaking, you're going to learn listening and speaking. Every normal child or every child without some other kind of physical or mental, cognitive kind of problem is going to learn the language that is in the home, and they are going to learn it to listen And hear, I guess, let's say hear first, listen later, and then they're going to learn to speak as well. That does not play out with reading and writing. Reading and writing don't come naturally the way listening and speaking do. We will deal with writing at some point, and you will probably be dealing with it a little bit earlier with your young students than we might, even with adult English language learners. But much of what we're going to do early on is going to be focused on listening and speaking. So the word read and read, or read and read, which we may be able to see differences in if we're looking at the written word, does not apply when we're talking about English language learners trying to learn how to understand spoken language. So we'll deal with it, but recognize that sometimes we have an advantage in that we can look at a written word and we know what we're reading, even outside of context, simply by looking at the form of the word. We talked about every language has styles. That happens with reading and writing as well, writing particularly. And when you're reading something, you will be reading the style that the author had meant for or was trying to use. But when you write, you'll use a writing style. Hopefully, as you're at least going through the education process, you will use standard academic English in your writing. Particularly in this class, I've talked about the fact that we need to do that because as you move out of the university and into the teaching environment, people are going to use you as a model. And that writing is going to be important. And how you write is going to be important. That does not say you abandon whatever your dialect is. I'm not suggesting that at all, but there's probably within the educational system an importance in dealing with that standard academic English. Now, so different styles in writing, just like in speaking. Writing is impacted by the same changes as speaking. If you go out and pick up let's say and we'll look at some of these pretty soon. If you go out and pick up a King James Bible, for instance, you'll be reading English from the 17th century. And you'll notice that writing is very different than what we use now. So writing changes just like speaking does. And a big issue that we will have to deal with, though, for us and for your students is spelling. Because unlike something really nice like Spanish, where I got 5 vowels and I got 5 vowel sounds, English is just nuts. And we've got all these combinations of double vowels that make it clear for us what the word is, but won't be clear to students who have a phonetic language where they see a letter and they know what that letter is. Ours is very different. So we've got that to really deal with, and it is a struggle. So keep that in mind. Finally, language change is normal. We've already mentioned down here, writing is impacted by changes in the language. So what you read from 3 centuries ago does not look like what you read written last week, whether that is the form or the style or even the words that are there. Language changes. And so as we're going along through life, we come up with new words all of the time. Hey, I used to be a computer guy. We used to talk about bytes, 8 digital switches in a grouping. That was not bite, had to do with biting an apple or getting bit by a dog, but it wasn't spelled with a Y. And to our students, bite, the dog bites, and this is 64 bytes, sounds like the same word. We read it differently, and that's where the reading part gives us an advantage. But it's a new word, B-Y-T-E. Astronaut is a new word, probably came along no earlier than the early 20th century. Cell phone is a word that came along at the end of the 70s or the very beginning of the 80s. These are all new words. We can talk about, Facebook, right? And we take a noun like the word friend and we turn it into a verb. Or we can take the noun text and suddenly we can do that on our phones, it is a verb or an action. And so text me is something new, and unfriend me is also very new, right? How do you unfriend somebody if friend was a noun? Well, it's a new word. Essentially, we have different meanings to old words. Gay, typically in the LGBTQ, means something very different than gay in terms of happy, joyous, or what's a good word? I can't think of another good word. But frivolous, perhaps. File. We used to have files. The file used to come in a manila folder. Now most files are sitting on computers and in computer storage. So the word file has changed often. And a computer used to be somebody who computes. Now it tends to be a machine, and there's probably nobody we would talk about and call them a computer anymore. We lose words. Thou, thy, thee, thine, thouest, all of those kinds of words, we don't use those anymore. And we borrow words like maelstrom. Where do you suppose, what kind of a word do you think maelstrom is? Anybody got a guess? Where do you think maelstrom came from? What kind of a word does it look like? Where does it look like it came from, Lorraine? Where does maelstrom look like it comes from? Any thoughts? Oh, just guess one so we can ridicule you for being wrong. Come on. Maelstrom?
Maelstrom.
Maelstrom, right here.
I have no idea.
Cool enough. It comes from Scandinavia somewhere, Danish, Norwegian, or English. I can look at that and I go, the strum is kind of European and Germanic. M-A-E-L, I don't know, maybe it's because my grandmother was Swedish and my grandfather was Danish, but I can recognize that as probably being Scandinavian. Okay, then we've got pistol. What do you think? Pistol. Where do you think pistol came from? You'll probably get it wrong, but go ahead and guess anyway. Christina. Cynthia. Oh, Christina, what did you say?
Latin, like, I don't know, maybe Spain or
Spain, Spanish? That's a great guess because most everybody always says, oh yeah, I can think of it in Spanish, it's pistola. Oh, so that's where we got it. Actually, they probably got it from us. I'm told that pistol comes from Czech, which is kind of weird. How about karma? Probably Indian. Okay, Christina, here's your chance to be a star. Where did we get amigo, burrito, and aficionado?
Mexico?
Yeah, okay, well, Spain, Spanish, somewhere we got it from Spanish, right? But we borrow words. We continue to borrow words. We don't call burritos a stuffing-filled tortilla. Oh, then we'd use tortilla, and then we'd be all messed up anyway. So we grab words from other places, kimchi and burritos and schnitzel if you're thinking about Germans, and I don't know what else we might get. But in any case, we borrow words and we change grammar rules. Now, I earlier mentioned double negatives, right? Said, okay, so there's going to be a lot of people who look at double negatives and they're going to say, well, that's just bad English because everybody knows we don't use, I don't have nothing. Which if we were to apply the regular rules of grammar means I have something. But in any case, we do it. I bet you everybody on this phone has done it in the last month. I've done it we may do it by accident. Other groups do it on purpose. But it's interesting to note that double negatives were perfectly fine back in Shakespeare's day, and they have changed. Some people think the way people say the word axe instead of ask is goofy or strange. But back in Shakespeare's day, that was the way the word was pronounced. It has changed for some and stayed the same for others. And then finally, who in place of whom is becoming very common. Yes, there are rules for when we should use who and when we should use whom, and you've probably been told those rules. But interestingly, most of us don't pay very much attention to that anymore. And the word whom is kind of falling out of at least spoken English. Most of the time we just say who. Who did you give it to? When it should be, to whom did you give it, right? I mean, we change it and everybody seems to be good with it. I kind of guess sooner or later whom may just disappear from the language. Nonetheless, language change is normal and it changes all the time. I'll give you another example. My wife is Korean. She's been married to me for 46 years, been living in the US for 39 years. When she watches Korean dramas, she has the audacity to ask me, what did they say? Like I want to know, because there have been so many new words that have come out of in Korean in the last 40 years, grammatical structures that have changed in the last 40 years, that it's a different language now than it was then. And given that she spent so much time talking in English with me or our kids, and so little time talking in Korean with her friends or family, she has lost touch with a lot of the nuance of the language. And so it's kind of comical when she'll ask me, what did they say? And the best I can do is read the subtitles, which are very frequently incorrect. So language changes, and it happens not just to English, not just to Korean, but it happens to everything. All right. So I'm going to stop here. This really kind of drives us to the end of Daniel's ideas. It preps us to get in there and start talking about the history of English. But before I go, any comments people want to make, questions that they want to make? Yes, ma'am. Our sir, our pod.
I didn't say anything.
Oh, I see. Oh, that's my hand. My hand is sitting on your space. I have a question. Are you ready to move on to the history of English? Yeah, I knew you were. Okay, cool. So let us go ahead on, and I'm going to move over. We're going to use these mind maps one more time. In this particular class, this may be the last time we actually use mind maps. But for those of you who might want to be able to have these so that you can follow them in your notes, you probably know that I've put out an announcement and a very short 3 or 4 minute video on how to pull off the mind maps, and the PowerPoints are out there also. So each day when I'm finished, I will put out mind maps or I will put out PowerPoints so that you've got those to go back to for your study. They'll be there and you can use them. All right. So what we're going to do is we're going to jump in here and we're going to start to talk about the history of language. But first, let's kind of take a quick overview of language families. So I'm going to switch here for a second. I'm going to go to a different set of slides. These are going to be a PowerPoint. And I'm going to just go up here and starting off, what we're going to do, we're going to look at language families. Now, there isn't necessarily a standard look at language families and names, but we can, and linguists do, go out there and they group languages into various groupings based on certain similarities, grammatical similarities, cognates, and so forth. It tends to be that they have come out of different regions. And let's see, you can see this, right? See the map? Okay, very good. So what we're going to be looking at is the common languages that are out there. We could start, let's go way down in the South Pacific. And we've got these Austronesian languages, or things that are spoken out around Malaysia, it's partly there, but Indonesia, over here in Madagascar, there are similarities between these. And if we get into Australia, New Zealand, the native languages that were there, the Aboriginal languages that are there, have certain similarities. And so we kind of group all of those things down in Australia and New Zealand as Australian and Papuan languages. That doesn't include English, even though that's probably the official language in both. But it's really looking at the indigenous languages that were there. And so we could also say the same about some of the stuff around Indonesia and Madagascar, call those Austronesian languages. Get up into Eastern Asia and Southeast Asia even, and we've run into Sino-Tai languages. These are the Chinese dialects, and there are also a bunch of other languages. So we might group them with Chinese and their various dialects. There's also a grouping that we could call down here in Cambodia, Vietnam, Laos, that would be called Khmer languages, Khmer. You can think of that as, if you're familiar with history, the Khmer Rouge, who were the communists who took over Cambodia right as the Vietnam conflict was coming to an end. But there are, as you might not be surprised, there are lots of commonalities in there. Now, the one that I think you would find strange is Indo-European languages. Notice that it starts down here in India, and it goes across much of Northern Europe. Not only does it go over here with Spain and France and Germany, but it goes with England, and it goes with Ireland, and it goes all the way across here through Siberia. Now, Indo-European languages is where English falls when we're talking about these major language families. And interestingly, that Indo is from languages that are spoken down in India. One of the very first times when people really started looking at where did English and all these European languages come from, they realized that they actually originated out of Sanskrit, which is an ancient Indian language. So Hindi and what are some of the others? Hindi, I'm trying to think of the one with a B, can't think of it off the top of my head. Bengali have interesting linkages to Indo-European, actually even up through Persia with Persian and Iranian stuff. So we've got this whole group here that was centered in Northern Europe and much of the Indian subcontinent that all really came together and influenced each other, and from which most of the languages that we're interested in or that we're familiar with came from there. Now, in this space here where it's red is what are called Uralo-Altaic languages. And it's kind of interesting. That's one of the Hungarian is one of those. So is Finnish and Lap. And some speculate, and I don't really necessarily agree with this, but it doesn't really matter what I think. Korean and Japanese are sometimes linked into this group as a part of the family. Interestingly, when you get into Japanese and Korean, everybody's always debating where did they come from and where did they have a common root, or are they different? But the idea here is in Europe and Asia, you think about the whole continents of Eurasia, there were some very simple beginnings that have blown out into a whole lot of different languages. We can go down into the Middle East and run into Semitic languages, which would include a number of varieties of Arabic. It also would include Hebrew. All Semitic languages having certain things in common. Sometimes it's sounds, sometimes it is, like I said, words and cognates, and other times it is grammar structures. Sub-Saharan Africa gets broken down into two different parts. There's the Niger-Congo languages and the Bantu languages. And then we get over here, interestingly, over into the Western Hemisphere, and we've got Amerindian languages. Now, we could be very familiar with Amerindian languages, at least from watching the Westerns, knowing that they spoke very differently. They weren't speaking English. Unfortunately, as you find in South America, most of those languages have died out and been crushed by Spanish and Portuguese. A little bit of French, but mostly Spanish and Portuguese for the most part. And that Spanish influence extends all the way up through Central America into the southwestern United States. But then we have English and Germanic languages kind of come in here. And for Amerindian languages, while they still exist, there are still people who speak them. They are very small, and they have largely been crushed, literally, through disease and through oppression by European languages. And that's kind of the way it works. If you think about it, currently they usually talk about there's probably 5,000, some people will estimate as high as 6,000 languages in the world. And that's not counting dialects. It's actually different, not non-mutually intelligible languages. But some of those languages die out every month. We lose languages because the last native speaker, even if they've passed it on to non-native speakers, the last of the late native speakers have died, and with them, to a certain degree, their cultures have died with them. So that is something kind of sobering to think about, but still 5,000 to 6,000 languages. If we're going to look at English, just kind of a map, and what I've done is I've really only drawn out the Indo-European family. But you can look across here and look at all of the things that we are familiar with. Indian languages, Sanskrit, Bengali, Hindu, and other things down there. Armenian. I mentioned already Iranian is coming out of this same tree. All of the Germanic languages, not just German, okay, but things up in the Scandinavian countries, with the exception largely of Finland. We've got Germanic coming down through those, and into regular German. High German is spoken today, Low German is spoken in other places. But down here, you can kind of follow this green line. And so you will see that English, modern English, derived from Middle English, derived from Old English, and Anglo-Saxon Germanic languages, up through this whole Germanic branch. And in addition to having Germanic, we've got the Slavic languages, Russian, Polish, Czech, and so forth, Albanian, the Celtic languages that were common in the British Isles. Not so common anymore, but Celtic impacted Ireland and Wales, the Gaelic languages, Breton, and had its influences on English, but not nearly as much as Germanic. And even Greek and Italian and Latin, and all of the Latin languages from French through Spanish, Italian, Catalan, Romanian, all of those are out there. But we're going to be focusing in here, as we would normally, by looking largely at English. And the fact that what has always surprised me is how closely related we are to Indian languages and Iranian, and even the Slavic languages like Russian. Get in and study Russian for a little while, you begin to run into a whole lot of cognates right off the bat. I was kind of surprised by that. Okay, so where did IE originate? Nobody really knows. Now, I showed you that this estimate was around 3,500 BC. This one says it's somewhere between 4,500 and 2,500 BC. There's very little consensus about where geographically this has arisen. If you think of all of Eurasia, you saw me have that there with that whole gold band all the way across Northern Europe and across the northern parts of Asia. Various people have come up with all kinds of different ideas. Where did English come from? France and Germany. Or this is actually Indo-European, I'm sorry. Some say it originated out of Egypt, others out of Russia, some out of Turkey. And even up here in the Germanic languages up here, but they've come from all over. And then at the same time, there are all these other languages, these largely being Uralic Altaic languages like Hungarian, Finnish, and Lap, Estonian, and some of the other things that are spoken out in Siberia. So one recent guy came up with the idea that it was probably somewhere in here that the language and the people who spoke it really originated. But it's all really still kind of speculation. So given all of that, we're going to go back to the mind map. We're going to start looking at English specifically and English through the centuries. So I'm going to share PowerPoint. Hopefully I get to it from there. It may take me a minute to get back to where I want to be. Here. You're going to close this out. And this is mind map 2. So I'm going to get out of that, hopefully, and find what I was looking for, the history of English, PowerPoint. Mind Manager, there it is. It's here somewhere. All right, so we've seen the language families idea. Now we're going to kind of work our way down through here. We want to start off with before English was really English, before it was anything really recognizable. And so this would be early origins, very early, and we'd probably call this Proto-English, meaning prototype English, or what English is going to be driven from. And so there are a number of things that we can look at in here about influences. One, we know that it's in the Indo-European family, so we can expect that wherever the Indo-European languages were impacted, we've probably been impacted by some of that as well. But getting a little more specific into the British Isles, there was the Celtic influence. This was very early. Originally, the Celtic kind of meant, it was a derogatory term for foreigners. It was a driving force for things like Irish, Gaelic, Welsh, Manx, and Scottish. Most of these not really spoken much anymore. They've basically been absorbed by English. But this was heavily influencing these, and you would still notice Celtic influences in Welsh. But it was common across the Europe, and particularly the Iberian Peninsula, in the first 1,000 years BC. Okay, so we're talking about 1000 BC up to 0. Very common across Europe and the Iberian Peninsula. What is the Iberian Peninsula? Where's the Iberian Peninsula? Somebody can tell me. Who? Who? Iberian Peninsula. Sebastian.
I'm not entirely sure of.
Not entirely sure. Are you kind of sure?
Not really.
Okay, I'll give you a break.
Is it in Europe?
Where's the you want to guess?
Is it in Europe?
Yes, it is in Europe. What part of Europe? Where would Contreras come from?
I was thinking Spain. Oh,
Yep, it is. That is exactly right. So it's Spain and Portugal. That whole peninsula out there of Spain and Portugal is called the Iberian Peninsula. And one of the places where Celtic was common in Europe was along the Iberian Peninsula, and it came right up the west coast of Europe from the Iberian Peninsula into the British Isles. And so as it got into about the 4th century BC, so that would have been the 400s BC, it was a fairly common thing across Britain and Ireland. Now, we can see that as an early influence. It doesn't have very much of an impact on current English vocabulary. Mostly places you'll find Celtic influences in location names, cities in Wales and various places. Probably had some phonological impacts, changing how we pronounced various letters or sounds. And it also, interestingly, was where we come up with continuous tenses. Those continuous tenses are things like I am going, she was leaving, etc., where there was some kind of a view of not just a moment in time, but in a duration of time. But this is probably one of the first ones, very common by the 4th century BC. Now, we'll start to look at Roman influence. Roman is going to be bringing in Latin. There were several invasions by Rome during the 1st century AD, starting in and around 43 AD. So as the Romans came in there as conquerors, they start bringing their language with them. And in addition, we'll see more with the Germanic coming up, but they also had influence over Germanic tribes in Europe and brought them in as mercenaries. And so some of that Latin was going to start getting mixed up with Germanic, but it brings in largely an initial round of Latin words. Okay, so this is the Roman influence with Latin and some Germanic. Then we get this Frisian influence. So I'm going to ask somebody a real hard, I already wrote it where it's from. Frisia, you've never heard of Frisia probably, but Frisia is a region in Northern Europe that really kind of contains the Netherlands, so it's Holland and those up there, and also Northern Germany as it faces the North Sea. This region was called Frisia. It had its own Germanic dialects. And so this is where the early Germanic impact on the local languages occurs. All right? So in our very early influences, Indo-European and wherever that originated, we had Celtic, we had some Latin influence, and we started to see Germanic influences, both by the mercenaries that the Romans brought in and probably regular travels by those people in that part of Europe. If you go out and look at the map, to get from Northern Europe on the North Sea over to the British Isles, it's not very far. Okay, so Proto-English, before English was English. Now, the next one that we want to talk about is Old English. And this is where we start to begin to see something that kind of resembles English, but you're going to see that as we look at it, you're not going to recognize very much at all in terms of the things that are called Old English. So let's take a look. Now, we talked about the 4th century, and then we talked about rolling into 43 AD and up through the 4th century with Rome having impact, some Germanic impact. The Old English language is basically laid out between the 5th and 11th century AD, from the 400s to the 1000s. Right? And German influence here is where it was really coming in seriously. The Romans brought some Germanic mercenaries onto the island up through the 5th century. But we also had arrivals of other Germanic peoples continued into the 6th century. Think about the North, the Vikings and so forth. They're all coming from Northern Europe and Scandinavia, all speaking some kinds of Germanic dialects or languages. And so out of this group here brought in by the Romans, we have some words that you hear commonly now. Anglo-Saxon. Now, you hear the words Anglo-Saxon, you think about Northern Europeans. And so the Angles were coming from Northern Germany. The Saxons were coming from Northern Germany. And then we have the Utes. How many people remember the movie My Cousin Vinny? Oh, please, Diana, you're the only person shaking her head. Well, he used to call people Utes. Who was he talking about when he was talking about the Utes? Come on now. I know some of you seen My Cousin Vinny. Okay, you can go down south and go to a Church of Christ place. The elders will talk about we got to have some programs for the youths. What are we talking about there, Diana? I see you mouthing the words. You know.
Youths, like the young.
Exactly. Well, we're not talking about youths. We're talking about the youths, and they came from Denmark. Okay? So these were some of the mercenaries that were brought in. They are bringing Germanish or Germanic languages into the area. And Latin was still there, but we also pick up some more new words as the church comes in and really starts sending missionaries into the British Isles during the 6th century. So this brought in a lot of new church words, but it's 400 new words from Latin. Most of the Celtic speakers are getting pushed out of that northeastern part of the British Isles, and they're being pushed down towards the south and to the west because those Germanic peoples are coming in and taking over. All right? And whilst Celtic languages were spoken into the 19th century, in the 1800s, they're mainly dead now. Very little do you hear anything of Celtic languages. Which I don't know exactly what it means, but I think it's kind of like, hi, how are you? Anyway, we get some of those words, but they're getting pushed out of the middle of England and out towards the periphery. And then we continue to have invasions by my ancestors, those rotten Scandinavians from Sweden and Denmark. And they continue on. That brings in even more Germanic. It brings in another dialect or another Germanic language that's talked about as Old Norse. It's centered in the northeast parts of the island because that's the closest part to their home origins. Quite similar to Anglo-Saxon because they're all Germanic and coming out of that same basic family. We get some language simplification when this comes in. We stop dropping a lot of the gender markings and case markings that some languages use. But you know, if you go back to German, they have masculine, feminine, and neuter genders, and they call them out very much with articles, much like Spanish does feminine and masculine. We seem not to have very much of that anymore. And so that is where it began to simplify. And we got another 2,000 words out of them. So we're still being the borrowers. Now, Old English was a product of the blending of all of these, but largely Germanic languages. So when somebody taught you where did English come from, you can justifiably say it really originated in German. And many of the most common words that we still use can be tracked back to German or Germanic or German's ancestral languages. It's largely unintelligible, and I'm going to give you an opportunity to prove that to yourselves on Thursday. Over half of the most common English words can be traced back to Old English and its Germanic roots. Anglo-Saxon influences provide idiomatic and concrete terms. One of my favorite items here is the idea of concrete terms. go in there and you go, a hearty welcome. I'm gonna change that and compare it with the way French would have been later on, but a hearty welcome. And one of the things that you notice about German is they didn't necessarily make the language nice and smooth. If you go to a restaurant today in the US and you eat pig meat, they don't call it pig meat, they call it pork. But if you go to a restaurant in Germany, pork is still called essentially swine flesh. And so you get pig feet and you get Schweinfleisch. And so we have some pretty concrete and, in my opinion, rough and hearty words, much more so than you would get in modern English now. But the big trick here is recognizing that we do not understand that Old English very well. Now, I'm going to move on. We probably have time to cover Middle English yet today. So I'm going to knock down some of this, get rid of it. Again, you can pull all of this back up looking at that video that says how to get the mind maps. Middle English, 11th century to the 15th century. I'm going to close this for a minute. I need a history major or a history buff. Anybody there is a history buff? Anybody? Anybody like history? Oh, somebody's got to like history. Come on, be brave. Well, I guess not. What happened in, oh, I can't remember it happened in the 1080, I think, something like 1080, that would have had a big influence on English and that whole Germanic thing. Anybody know? Anybody ever take history? Sure, everybody took history, but how much of it do we remember? Not very much. Well, this is going to stretch from the 11th century, the 1000s, to the 15th century, the 1400s. And the big thing that really rocked English and the way that it was built and spoken was the Norman conquest of 1066 AD. And just to prove that I'm just like you and I don't remember all that history stuff, I think it was the Battle of Hastings, I think. But in any case, the 1066 AD, the Norman come in and they start to take over the British Isles, taking it away from those Germanic peoples. And so as they came in, we have this Old Norman dialect, which is a dialect of French, no longer spoken. But nonetheless, they bring in all kinds of new words. Okay? I got to remember to do something. There, got it. All right. So now we take Germanic, we take Celtic, and we take Latin, and we're going to add French to it. Now, interestingly, French is already kind of Latin-based, so it's one of the Latin languages. Unlike English, some people think English is a Romance language because it's like French and it's like Spanish. But the Romance languages were the things derived more so from Latin. And so now we're adding in French, and with it, obviously, additional Latin influences. So what you might not realize is that this version of French, was the prestige language used at court. All of the kings and queens of the royals were likely to be French speakers or Old Norman French speakers. Okay? And it was the official language on the British Isles until about the 14th century, right? 1300s. But English starts to re-emerge and become a little more common in the literature and in a common use in speaking in about the mid-13th century. So French has really held sway probably for a couple centuries. But as we get into this 13th century, English starts coming out. And so we've got to recognize, and I'm sure you do, if you've ever looked at French, how many words, much like looking at Spanish, how many words look similar? Well, it's all of that Latin influence. And for English, it's that French influence on English. So we look at this and we got approximately 10,000 old Norman or French words were taken in as loan words for Middle English. And the writing system changed and we started getting different symbols and different sounds like the TH sound in the and this and thing and think. So we get the writing system changes. And we might find, you may remember my old comment about how I like the idea of a hearty welcome. Just sounds more manly than a cordial reception. But the French would have been smoother and a little less, probably a little less harsh in their language. And so, much like the Germans still talk about eating swine flesh, the French have daintied it all up and made it pork. Just like they took cow flesh and made it beef and chicken and made it poultry. They came up with new words, and so a little bit more formal, a little bit more smooth, and a little less harsh, at least in my idea. So while I like a hearty welcome more than a cordial reception, here's what I want. Finally, Middle English continued to simplify the grammar. So we start losing or standardizing word endings. Interestingly, the Germanic en, which is the way they mark plurals and still mark plurals to this day, has largely dropped off and been replaced with a much more standard s. Now give me some Germanic plurals then. If I say an en is the way German marks their plurals, what are some English words today that we've got that we pluralize as if we were still speaking German? I'm going to start at the top of my list. Jen, give me some words that we pluralize with en.
With en, you said?
I'm sorry?
You said pluralize with en?
Plurals that end in en, yeah.
I'm not, nothing's coming up.
So you're calling on Gally. Gally, you're next, buddy. We got to have some words that plurals, that plural nouns that end in en.
I am also not sure.
Oh, come on.
I just thought of
Okay, Jen is reclaiming the crown.
children.
Very good. We got men, we got women, we got children, and we got oxen. Those are the four that I can think of. But they are all marking plurals with the old Germanic way of marking them. And it's interesting that we do that because think about how common men, women, and children are. Right? I mean, they're very common words, common concepts. Oxen, somehow we kept that when we moved in there. But nonetheless, we started during this period to move away from that en plurals and move to today's s. And we continued to remove grammatical and gender distinctions. Okay, so if we go up here, the Norman Conquest, I guess I've covered everything in this part. I could show you some words that we have, things that have simplified. Let me jump over to this, perhaps. Did that pop up on your screen?
No, it's just.
No, you're still seeing the old thing, right? Okay, let me jump out of this and jump back in, but this time I want to use that. Share it. Now, nominative, these are different, these are simplifications that we have run through. And so interrogative pronouns. What does interrogative mean? Let's see, I already called on Jen and I called on Gally. I haven't called on Diana lately. What does interrogative mean?
I think of questions or questions.
Exactly. We had specific words that we used as pronouns when we were asking questions. We also had gender. You see, I've got masculine and feminine above the line. I've got neuter down below the line. And as you look across here, going from Old English, we're going to get, this is the first word in Beowulf, wait. So we're going to get to that next time. But wait, we changed it to what? Now we don't have two. We just kind of have one. Quam, quam, qui, won. Now we're kind of simplifying this down. And we get out of here to modern English and we don't have multiples anymore. We tend to have just one word, with the exception here of who and whom. But as I mentioned before, I personally figure if I live to be 167, which I probably won't, I will be able to die without having to say whom anymore. Some of you may make it, but I'll be interested to see if whom doesn't actually drop out of the vocabulary. Nonetheless, this was simplification that we saw. Now I'm going to bring us back later to Beowulf and some other things for us to look at so that you can make a personal comparison of these different forms of language or forms of English. And let's see, I don't have time to cover modern English, or I don't want to, whichever comes first. So what I think I will do is go ahead and stop at this point. We're going to finish up modern English. We're going to look at English in the three various forms and do some work with those. And then we're going to launch ourselves into at least a very brief talk on phonetics. That's going to be our topic as we get back into the classroom on Monday. We will be thoroughly focused in on phonetics and phonology. We're going to move along with the grammar, the linguist's view of the grammar of the language from that point forward. Okay? So with that in mind, I'm going to stop talking. And as I always do when we're doing it this way, I will wait until everybody is gone before I sign off. And if you have questions of me, please hang on and you can ask them in front of others, or you can stay and listen to others' questions, or you can just go end this session, whichever you like. I know Diana's on her way out. She's already smiling because she heard the word end. Yep, there it
I
is.
actually had a question.
Oh, yes, certainly you did. Just, yes. What's your question?
Yeah, so I just got my book today. I was wondering what chapters I should read
Yes.
up until
Well, if you look at the syllabus, well, from last week, you should have read chapter 1, which is all of 3 pages long.
Mhm.
So that's a killer. Yeah, it's not even 3 whole pages and no questions. And then we're going to be jumping out to chapter 6. As you may remember, I said we're going to do something goofy. We're going to go out to chapter 6 and work our way backwards because it makes more sense than the other. And if you look on the syllabus, you've only got, actually, you don't even have to read chapter 3 until next week. And then it's only 90 pages, 99 to 105. But we should have the Wikipedia article for history should have read for today. There's another short history from Merriam-Webster. It's out on D2L also. You should just kind of read through that for
And
Thursday.
there is no like homework, right, that we have to fill out. It's just the readings for now.
For now,
Okay.
that will change. Oh, bummer.
Bye.
See you later. Any other questions? Now they're leaving. They're jumping ship. Let's see.
Have a good day.
You too.
Thank you.
Mandy got a question? Ilani got a question? Are you there? Mandy, are you there? Ilani,
I'm
are
here.
you there? Ah, very good. I haven't seen your face.
Hmm.
Hmm.
Yeah.
It's good to have you in class again, though.
Yeah.
Hey, did you have a question for me?
For the book, I know it's a version 5, but like I saw on like Amazon or like online that there's like different covers for the book. I'm not sure which one is the correct one.
Okay, so I'm going to hold up the one that this is the 5th version.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that there is another copy of the 5th version. I can't remember if it's this book or the 402 book. But what you really want to do is get the 5th version, because otherwise, if you get an earlier version, this is the latest one. If you get an earlier one, you're likely to have different pages, and you're likely to have different exercises. So it might get kind of confusing.
Oh, okay.
But even if you get a used book, shooting for the fifth edition would be good.
Okay.
All right.
Yeah.
Okay. You know what else you might do? You
Yes.
might just talk with some of your friends who are also in these courses and see if anybody has an old 301, an old book you could borrow. That's always a possibility.
Okay. Okay. Thank you.
All right. All right.
Yes.
You have a good day. Okay.
You too. Bye.